So my talk today is about kings and the king and his crowns. So the impetus for all this and the impetus for the big debate that's happening in this sphere came from a one line as part of a speech delivered by Lord Hoffmann in a little known judgment that hardly anybody's read called Cork Fishing, in which Lord Hoffmann said, the Queen, referring to Her late Majesty, the Queen is as much the Queen of the United Kingdom as she is the Queen of England and Wales, the Queen of Scotland, and the Queen of Northern Ireland. Now, what Lord Hoffmann appeared to suggest at that particular sentence was that the Queen is not just the Queen of the UK, but also takes on a different capacity, a different crown, when she is in each of the constituent nations of the United Kingdom. And that led to quite a drama in the lead up to the coronation of Charles III. You see, up until then, everyone thought there was only one crown of the United Kingdom. But then came all this squabbling. Scotland said, we want him to say he's the King of Scotland. And what was going to happen with the coronation oath? Now, the UK government and the palace did not want to deal with this. They thought, oh my goodness, big legal question, we're not going to resolve it. So what they said is they put the coronation oath to say, the King of the United Kingdom, his other realms and territories. And they completely avoided the legal drama and the issues there. Well, I didn't want to avoid it, and my research is to look at this issue specifically. Now, I always find it quite interesting whenever I introduce this to an English or a British audience, because they're like, of course, you know, the king, the queen, you know, of course, there's such a British institution. And it's interesting people say that because where I come from in Australia, the queen or the king is the king of Australia. And Canadians think of him as the King of Canada. And around the world, in each of the king's different countries and realms and territories, they kind of think of him quite differently. So I wanted to research this space, and I wanted to go start at the very beginning. Now, before 1926, it was settled that the king or the crown was one and indivisible. It was the same king, the King of the United Kingdom, that ruled across all of his different territories, all of his colonies, all of his nations, and so on. And after World War I, this began to change. Three of these dominions, South Africa, the Irish Free State, and Canada, wanted greater autonomy. They didn't like this idea that the king, because he was only one king, was being advised by British ministers from the Westminster, accountable to the Westminster Parliament. They wanted to be able to advise the king directly. And after a series of conferences and a long discussion and negotiation, that occurred. In relation to 7 of the king's dominions, they acquired the right to be able to advise the king themselves, without any British control, without any British veto, without any British pre-approval. Now, what that meant is that when the king was being advised by a completely different set of ministers, he was being advised in a different capacity. So when he was being advised by Canadian ministers, he wasn't the King of the United Kingdom anymore. He was really the King of Canada, being advised by Canadian ministers who are accountable and responsible to the Canadian Parliament. So that led to the divisibility of the crown. Now, if I can go back to Australia, I think Australia really is the best place to study and look at all of this, because Australia is a federation. We have a Commonwealth, I guess, which of course central government, and then we've got 6 individual states, and each of them have a direct relationship to His Majesty the King. And what happened in 1930 is that, yes, the Commonwealth ministers at the top level of the government, they got the ability to advise the king directly. So there was now a King of Australia being advised by Commonwealth ministers on Commonwealth matters. But the states didn't want to be involved, and neither did the British government want to change the position of the states. So the states remained British dependencies, and the states were actually British, were advised, dealt with matters involving the king or the queen on the advice of British ministers. So it was British ministers who tendered advice to the King of the United Kingdom, despite the fact that they were within the same independent sovereign nation, Australia. And for several decades after that, this bifurcated crown wasn't really talked about. No one thought it was an issue. And the states thought basically the British government was just going to do whatever they told them. They thought the British government was a mere postbox for advice to go from them to the monarch. Well, that kind of was challenged in the 1970s. You see, the British government thought that, well, hang on, if we're going to be the ones tendering advice, if we're going to be the ones countersigning a commission or an order in council or whatever it may be, then we're going to be accountable in the Westminster Parliament for that advice. That's how responsible government works in this country. And they said to themselves, well, if that's the case, we're not going to tender advice merely because the states tell us. We're going to go and bring our own independent judgment on this very issue. And this came to a head in relation to the reappointment of Sir Colin Hannah to be the Governor of Queensland. When Sir Colin was Governor, he delivered some pretty controversial remarks where he criticised the Commonwealth Government. This is a state in Queensland, the state of Queensland, which is within Australia, and their Governor, the King or the Queen's representative at the time, was critical of the Commonwealth Government, which was another one of Her Majesty's governments. And the British government was absolutely livid about this. They were furious that someone who was representing the Queen would go and criticise another one of the Queen's very governments. And basically, when the British government secretly considered actually advising the Queen to remove Sir Colin as governor. Now, they said, oh, well, that's going to create a bit of a quagmire. We better just, his term's about to expire, so we'll just let this go. But then when his term was about to expire, the Queensland government said, we want you to reappoint Sir Colin. We really like Sir Colin. We don't like this Commonwealth government that he's got there. And basically the British government said no. They put their foot down and they said, we will not tender that advice to the Queen. And that led to quite a shock in Australia. In fact, Australians, both progressive, conservative, those in the middle, were really shocked at this idea that the British were able to intervene and stop this from happening. It was this idea that the representative was always going to be someone chosen by the government in Australia and not by some government halfway around the world. So what this basically led to what's called the Australia Acts. Now, in the lead up to the Australia Acts, the state said, oh, we want to be able to directly advise the King directly. And the British government said, oh, no, we're not going to let you do that, for two main reasons. The first reason was they said, well, if you're going to be able to advise people directly, then the states will basically become independent countries, just like the Commonwealth, just like Canada. And that's going to basically put them on an equal footing as if they're independent nation states themselves. And that wasn't going to work in a federation. The second objection they had was they were worried about the Queen receiving conflicting advice, one from a state premier and the other from the Australian Prime Minister. Now, basically, they sent this all the way to the law officers who looked at this and they said, well, on the first issue, no. Giving the separate crowns won't create independent nation states. At the time in 1930, a lot of those dominions that received separate crowns weren't independent themselves. For example, at the time, Canada was not an independent nation. So this is not a big deal. And secondly, the issue with conflicting advice can be resolved. And basically what they tried to do was they tried to find the one thing, or the very few things, that there would be no dispute, of there being conflicting advice. And they said basically the appointment of a state governor is one thing that is clearly within the reserve of the state and nothing to do with the Commonwealth government. So they said this very one thing, we're going to allow the state premiers to directly advise the Queen, but everything else is going to be exercisable. Anything involving honours, anything involving all kinds of things was going to be exercisable by the governor of the state. Now, the thing is, what they did here was, one thing that the Crown Law officers said is, we're not entirely sure whether you're going to create 6 individual separate crowns in Australia so that there'll be 7 crowns all up. We think what's likely to be a better idea is that you actually transform the current Crown of Australia into a sub-divisible crown, so that the King is being advised by different ministers within Australia according to their constitutional responsibility. So state ministers would advise on state matters under the Constitution, and Commonwealth ministers would advise on Commonwealth matters under our broad constitutional structure. And that was largely accepted, although not everyone fully agreed. So that has created what I call the sub-divisible crown, and kind of created this new concept here. So what this shows in Australia, I submit, is kind of two really key things. The first is the fact you've got a separate government, the fact that you've got your own government, you've got ministers, you've got courts, you've got a legislature, doesn't mean you create a separate crown. A separate crown is created when ministers are able to directly advise the monarch. But there's an exception to that rule, and that occurs where you've got constitutional arrangements within a country, and then you can create a subdivisible crown instead, so that there is one Crown of Australia who is advised by different ministers according to the constitutional allocation of powers. So how does that bring me back to the United Kingdom today? So, as a result of devolution, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland now have their own governments, they have their own legislatures, and Scottish and Welsh ministers have the ability to directly advise His Majesty the King on certain enumerated matters. Of course, British ministers continue to advise the King in relation to all matters within the United Kingdom, including Scottish and Welsh matters that are within what's called reserved matters. And essentially, what I submit has happened here is that the Crown of the United Kingdom remains one and unitary, but it has very much like Australia transformed into a subdivisible crown. The King is still the King of the United Kingdom, despite what Lord Hoffmann might say. But he is advised by different ministers according to their constitutional responsibility. And how do we know where it's within their constitutional responsibility? We look at the provisions of UK Acts of Parliament. We would look at the Scotland Act, the Wales Act, and the Northern Ireland Act. So that way, when people in Belfast, when people in London, when people around the UK say, "God save the King," or "Long live the King," they're referring to the same King, the King of the United Kingdom. Thank you very much.